The morning air at the Kentucky Horse Park carried a crisp chill, mingling with the familiar scents of freshly cut grass and horse stables. The sun, still low on the horizon, cast a golden light over the sprawling grounds. Trainers barked orders, jockeys adjusted their saddles, and owners exchanged nods, all while spectators filled the grandstands with an electric hum of excitement. The biggest race of the season was just hours away. Jack Connors, a rugged man in his mid-40s, stood near the stable area, his boots planted firmly on the gravel path. His weathered face and sharp green eyes betrayed years of dedication and struggle in the racing world. Today, however, his usual calm demeanor was replaced by an undercurrent of tension. His horse, Midnight, was the favorite to win, a sleek, jet-black thoroughbred with a reputation for speed and grace. Jack placed a hand on Midnight's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the horse's glossy coat. "You're ready for this, aren't you, boy?" he murmured. Midnight nickered softly, his ears flicking back toward Jack as if to acknowledge him. Luis, Jack's stable hand, approached with a confident stride. "He's looking sharp, Mr. Connors. Midnight's been clocking some of the best times I've seen." Jack nodded, though his jaw remained tight. "He better be. Everything's riding on this. My name, my reputation, and let's not forget, my damn mortgage." Luis hesitated, sensing the weight behind Jack's words. "He'll deliver," he said, more to reassure himself than Jack. The day carried high stakes for Jack. Over the years, he had faced financial troubles that stripped him of almost everything he'd built. Midnight was his last shot at reclaiming his place among the elite in the racing circuit. The horse wasn't just an animal to Jack, he was a lifeline. The grandstands began to fill as the announcer's voice boomed through the loudspeakers, listing the day's lineup. Jack could hear the names of familiar rivals and felt the knot in his stomach tighten. Among the crowd was Mike Reynolds, a wealthy breeder with a penchant for making others feel small. Well, Jack Connors," Mike said, sidling up to him with a smug grin. "Bet you're feeling good about Midnight today. I've put a sizable wager on him. Hope he doesn't disappoint." Jack's eyes narrowed. "I don't need your bets, Mike. Stay out of my business." His tone was sharp, laced with years of resentment. Mike chuckled, clearly enjoying the tension, before walking off. As the horses were led toward the paddock, the atmosphere grew more charged. Midnight pranced slightly, his energy barely contained. Jack leaned in close to Luis. "Keep an eye on him. Any sign he's not ready, I need to know." Luis nodded and walked Midnight toward the saddling area. Jack watched them go, his gut churning. Something about the day felt off. He dismissed the thought, chalking it up to nerves. This wasn't the time to second-guess. Midnight was the fastest horse he'd ever trained, and he had complete faith in him. Still, a small voice in the back of Jack's mind nagged at him. Midnight had been restless lately, his usual focus seeming slightly fractured. Jack blamed it on the intensity of the training leading up to the race, but as he watched his horse disappear into the crowd, he couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. Standing on the edge of the track, Jack took a deep breath. This was it. Years of hard work, every sacrifice he had made, all came down to this moment. The crowd roared as the horses approached the starting gate, the announcer's voice growing more animated. Jack's grip tightened on the brim of his hat. He had done everything to prepare for this day. But as Midnight moved closer to the starting line, Jack's uneasy feeling grew stronger. He couldn't explain it, but something told him that today wasn't going to go as planned. The grandstands vibrated with excitement as the race drew near. Spectators leaned forward in their seats, scanning the lineup of sleek, muscled thoroughbreds being guided toward the starting gates. Midnight, with his shimmering black coat, stood out among the competition, his powerful frame exuding both elegance and raw strength. Jack stood by the railing, his hands gripping the cold metal as he watched Luis lead Midnight toward the gate. The horse was usually calm and focused before a race, his disciplined demeanor a testament to the rigorous training he had undergone. But today was different. Midnight's ears twitched nervously, his muscles rippling as he shifted on his hooves. Luis glanced back at Jack, his brow furrowed. "He's acting strange," he called over the crowd's noise. "I don't know what's spooking him." Jack felt his stomach twist. Just get him in there, he shouted back, trying to mask his growing unease. He couldn't afford to lose control now, not when everything was on the line. As Luis guided Midnight closer to the starting gate, the horse suddenly reared up, letting out a loud, piercing neigh. The crowd gasped as the powerful animal broke free from Luis's grip, bolting away from the track and toward the open field. The scene unfolded in seconds, leaving everyone in stunned silence. Midnight, Jack roared, his voice barely cutting through the chaos. He leapt over the railing, his boots hitting the ground with a heavy thud, and sprinted after the horse. The announcer's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing a delay. Please remain seated as the situation is handled." But Jack wasn't listening. His focus was entirely on Midnight, whose ebony figure was disappearing into the distance. Behind him, Luis shouted, "Jack, he's heading toward the north gate." Jack didn't respond. His breath came in sharp bursts as he ran, his mind racing even faster. Midnight had never done anything like this before. The horse was the epitome of discipline, trained to perfection. So why now? Why, on the most important day of Jack's life, had Midnight chosen to rebel? Reaching the edge of the track, Jack spotted a trail of hoofprints in the dirt leading out toward the open fields beyond the horse park. A security guard rushed up to him. "Mr. Connors, we've got people heading out to find him. Just stay." "I don't need anyone else," Jack snapped, cutting the man off. "This is my horse. I'll bring him back." The guard hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, allowing Jack to continue. Luis caught up, slightly out of breath. "Jack, wait. You can't just chase him on foot. Let's grab the truck." Jack nodded reluctantly, following Luis back toward the parking lot. His frustration boiled over as he slammed his hand against the side of the truck. Why the hell would he do this, Luis? What the hell scared him? Luis climbed into the driver's seat, starting the engine. "I don't know, Jack, but something's not right. Midnight's never acted like this." The truck roared to life as they sped down the narrow service road, following the trail of footprints. Jack sat silently, staring out the window. His mind replayed the scene over and over. The moment Midnight broke free, the way he had bolted as if driven by something beyond fear. "Up ahead," Luis said, pointing. In the distance, they spotted Midnight. The horse had slowed down, his figure now stationary near a wooden fence at the edge of a field. Jack's heart pounded as Luis brought the truck to a halt. He jumped out, his boots crunching against the gravel, and approached cautiously. Midnight stood still, his head lowered as if transfixed by something or someone. That's when Jack saw her. A young girl, no older than 11, stood just a few feet away from Midnight. Her blonde hair was tied back in a loose ponytail, and her simple jeans and t-shirt looked slightly too big for her frame. She was holding out a hand toward Midnight, her expression calm and unafraid. Jack froze. "Who the hell is that?" he muttered under his breath. Luis came up behind him, equally stunned. "I don't know, but look at Midnight." The horse, usually restless in unfamiliar situations, was completely calm. His ears were relaxed, and his breathing had slowed. It was as if the girl's presence had cast a spell on him. Jack stepped closer, his voice sharp. "Hey, what are you doing with my horse?" The girl turned slowly, her blue eyes meeting Jack's. "Your horse?" she asked softly, her tone almost accusatory. "He came to me." Jack stopped in his tracks, confused and slightly unnerved by the certainty in her voice. Midnight didn't flinch or move, standing firmly by her side as though he belonged there. "Look," Jack said, his frustration bubbling to the surface, "I don't know who you are, but that horse is mine. He's worth more than you can imagine, and I need to get him back to the track." The girl didn't back down. "His name isn't Midnight," she said quietly. "It's Shadow, and he remembers me." Jack blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "What the hell are you talking about?" The girl stepped closer, her hand still resting on Midnight's neck. "He used to live with us. He was born on our farm." Jack stared at her, disbelief and irritation battling for dominance in his mind. "That's impossible," he muttered. But deep down, something about her words struck a nerve. Midnight let out a soft whinny, leaning into the girl's touch. Jack's frustration boiled over. Luis, get the damn halter. We're taking him back. The girl's eyes narrowed. You can try, she said, her voice firm. But he's not going anywhere unless he wants to. Jack hesitated, caught between anger and confusion, as the strange bond between the girl and his horse began to unravel everything he thought he knew. Jack took a step closer, his boots crunching against the gravel as he stared at the girl and his horse. Midnight, no, Shadow, as she called him, stood motionless, his body relaxed in a way Jack had never seen before. The tension in his muscles had melted away, replaced by a calm that seemed to radiate from the girl's presence. Jack's tone sharpened, frustration seeping into his words. Listen, kid, I don't know who you are or what you think you're doing, but that horse is mine. I've got a race to win, and he's coming back with me. The girl didn't flinch. Her eyes, bright and steady, met Jack's with surprising resolve. He's not just your horse, she said evenly. He came to me because he remembers. Jack frowned, glancing at Midnight, who stood as still as a statue. Remembers what? Horses don't just remember. They follow training, instinct, discipline. What are you even talking about? Luis, standing behind Jack, cleared his throat. Jack, maybe we should hear her out. Midnight's never acted like this before. Jack shot Luis a glare, but the girl took the opportunity to step closer. His name is Shadow, she said softly, running her hand along Midnight's neck. He was born on our farm. My mom and I raised him. I used to take care of him every day. Jack hesitated, his mind racing. Midnight's papers had listed a small farm outside Lexington as his place of birth. He had barely glanced at the details at the time, focused only on the horse's potential. But now, looking at this girl, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. You're telling me he was your horse? Jack asked, his voice skeptical but quieter now. The girl nodded. He wasn't mine to own, but he was mine in every way that mattered. I called him Shadow because he followed me everywhere, like my shadow. Then one day, he was gone. Her voice broke slightly, and she looked down, her hand pausing on Midnight's coat. Mom said we had to sell him. We didn't have a choice. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his irritation tempered by a flicker of guilt. He had heard stories like this before. Small farms forced to sell their best horses just to stay afloat. But he had never thought much about the people behind those decisions. What's your name? Jack asked, his voice softening. Emily, she replied, standing a little taller now. And I know you don't believe me, but he remembers. He knows where he came from. Jack crossed his arms, glancing at Midnight again. The horse hadn't moved an inch, his ears flicking only slightly as Emily spoke. It was uncanny. Midnight had never shown this kind of attachment to anyone, not even Jack. Even if that's true, Jack began, trying to regain control of the situation. He's been trained for racing now. That's his life. He's not a farm horse anymore. Emily shook her head. It's not about where he is. It's about how he feels. He's not happy, is he? That's why he ran. Jack opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. Midnight had been restless lately, more than usual. Jack had chalked it up to pre-race jitters or overtraining, but now he wasn't so sure. Luis, sensing the shift in Jack's demeanor, stepped forward cautiously. Jack, you've got to admit, this is strange. Midnight never acts like this. Maybe she's onto something. Jack rubbed his temples, frustration bubbling up again. What am I supposed to do, Luis? Hand over my horse because some kid says he remembers her? This horse is worth more than my entire farm. I can't just— You don't have to give him up, Emily interrupted. But you can't force him to do something he doesn't want. Look at him. Does he look like a racehorse to you right now? Jack stared at Midnight. The horse looked completely at ease, his head resting against Emily's shoulder. It was a stark contrast to the tense, agitated animal Jack had seen earlier at the track. For the first time, Jack began to doubt himself. What do you want me to do? Jack asked finally, his voice edged with defeat. Emily looked at him, her expression earnest. Just let him stay here for a while. Let him rest. I'll take care of him, and you can come see him whenever you want. If he wants to go back to racing, he'll let you know. Jack let out a bitter laugh. Horses don't just let you know, kid. Maybe not, Emily said quietly. But maybe you've never really listened. The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He glanced at Louise, who gave a small shrug. It's your call, Jack, Louise said. But maybe she's right. Maybe Midnight's been trying to tell us something. Jack exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping slightly. He looked back at Midnight, the horse who had carried all his hopes and dreams, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. A quiet sadness in those dark eyes. Fine, Jack said gruffly, pointing a finger at Emily. He can stay here. But this isn't permanent, you hear me? I'm coming back for him. Emily smiled, her relief evident. That's all I'm asking. Jack turned away, his emotions tangled in a way he couldn't quite untangle. As he climbed back into the truck with Louise, he cast one last glance at Midnight and Emily standing together in the field. For the first time, Jack wondered if the life he had built for Midnight was the one the horse really wanted, or if he had been blind to what Midnight needed all along. Jack sat in the passenger seat of the truck as Louise drove back toward the horse park. The hum of the engine filled the silence between them, but Jack's mind was far from quiet. His thoughts churned, replaying the events of the past hour. Midnight bolting, the girl standing fearlessly beside his prized horse, and the words she had spoken with a conviction that left him unsettled. Shadow, Jack muttered, almost to himself. What kind of name is that for a racehorse? Louise glanced at him, his hands steady on the wheel. Maybe it's not a racehorse's name, Jack. Maybe it's his name. Jack shot him a sharp look, but didn't respond. Instead, he stared out the window, watching the rolling hills of Kentucky pass by. The sight of those green fields usually brought him a sense of peace, a reminder of why he had dedicated his life to horses. But now, all he felt was doubt. He's not her horse anymore, Jack said, breaking the silence. I bought him, trained him, turned him into what he is today. Louise hesitated before responding. That might be true, but, Jack, you saw them together. Midnight, Shadow, wasn't just calm. He was different. Like he knew her, like he was home. Jack let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. You think I don't know that? I saw it too, Louise. But what the hell am I supposed to do? Give up everything I've worked for? Midnight is my last chance to turn this around. I'm not walking away from that. Louise nodded slowly but didn't say anything. He understood Jack's position. The man had poured his heart, soul, and finances into Midnight, betting everything on the horse's success. But Louise couldn't ignore what he'd seen back there. Midnight hadn't just calmed down. He'd found something or someone that mattered to him in a way Louise couldn't explain. Back at the horse park, the atmosphere had shifted. The crowd had thinned, and the other horses were already back in their stables. The announcer's voice had faded, replaced by the murmur of people packing up and heading home. Jack walked to the stable where Midnight should have been, feeling the emptiness more acutely now. Mike Reynolds was waiting for him, leaning casually against the fence with a smirk that made Jack's blood boil. Well, Connors, Mike drawled. I hear your champion decided to take a little stroll. Can't say I'm surprised. A horse like that needs a real trainer to keep him in line. Jack clenched his fists, but forced himself to stay calm. Not today, Mike, he said through gritted teeth. I've got bigger problems than dealing with you. Mike laughed, clearly enjoying the opportunity to needle Jack. Bigger problems, huh? Like figuring out how to explain to your investors that their favorite horse has gone AWOL? Good luck with that. Jack stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. If you're so worried about my horse, maybe you should focus on keeping your own out of last place. Mike's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. We'll see who's in last place when this season's over, he said, turning to leave. Good luck with your situation, Connors. Jack watched him go, his anger simmering just below the surface. The last thing he needed was Mike sticking his nose into his business. But as much as Jack hated to admit it, Mike wasn't entirely wrong. How was he supposed to explain what had happened? More importantly, how was he supposed to fix it? That evening, Jack sat alone in the tack room, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. The stable was quiet, save for the occasional sound of a horse shifting in its stall. Normally, this was his favorite time of day. when the noise and chaos faded and he could focus. But tonight, his mind wouldn't settle. He thought about Emily's words, about how Midnight wasn't happy. The idea grated against everything Jack believed. Horses didn't have feelings like that. They had instincts, training, routines. But the look in Midnight's eyes today had been impossible to ignore. It was the same look Jack had seen in horses that had been pushed too hard, treated as machines rather than animals. For years, Jack had prided himself on being different. He cared for his horses, gave them the best of everything. But was that enough? Had he been so focused on winning that he'd missed what Midnight really needed? Luis knocked lightly on the doorframe, breaking Jack's train of thought. "You okay?" he asked, stepping inside. Jack shrugged. "What do you think?" Luis sat down across from him. "I think you've got a lot to figure out. But, Jack, maybe this isn't about you. Maybe it's about him." Jack stared into his coffee, his jaw tight. "If I don't race him, I lose everything. And if you keep pushing him, what do you lose then?" Luis countered. His voice was calm but firm. "You've always said you wanted what's best for your horses. Maybe this is your chance to prove it." Jack didn't respond, but the weight of Luis's words hung heavy in the air. Deep down, Jack knew he had a choice to make. One that would define not only Midnight's future but his own. The morning sunlight seeped through the cracks in Jack's blinds, casting long, thin beams across the small room he used as his office. He hadn't slept much. His thoughts kept circling back to Emily, to her words, and most of all, to the way Midnight, or Shadow, had responded to her. It didn't make sense, and yet, it made too much sense for him to ignore. Jack poured a strong cup of coffee and sank into his chair, staring at a stack of unopened bills on his desk. The weight of his financial troubles pressed against his chest like a boulder, but even that wasn't enough to drown out the nagging voice in his head. What if she's right? By mid-morning, Luis arrived at the stable, greeting Jack with a cautious nod. "You doing okay?" he asked, his tone careful. Jack grunted. "Define okay. I've got a horse that won't race, a kid telling me he doesn't want to, and a bank breathing down my neck. Yeah, I'm just great." Luis leaned against the doorway. "I've been thinking, maybe we should head over to her farm, figure out what she's talking about. If Midnight, or Shadow, whatever, really was hers, there's got to be something more to this." Jack sighed, rubbing his temple. "You really think going down memory lane is going to solve anything?" Luis shrugged. "Can't hurt. And let's be honest, you're not exactly drowning in solutions right now." Reluctantly, Jack agreed. "Fine, let's go. But don't expect me to turn this into some heartwarming reunion." Emily's farm was about an hour's drive from the horse park, nestled in the rolling hills outside Lexington. As they turned down the long gravel driveway, Jack took in the sight of the modest home and the weathered red barn that stood at the property's center. Fields stretched out on either side, dotted with a few grazing horses. It was a picture of simplicity, far removed from the high-stakes world Jack was used to. Emily was outside, sitting on the edge of the barn's open door. She looked up as the truck approached, her face a mix of caution and curiosity. Midnight stood nearby, his coat gleaming in the morning light. The horse was untethered but stayed close to Emily, his movements relaxed and unhurried. Jack stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching on the gravel. "I'm here," he called, his tone brusque. "Let's hear it. What's the big story about Midnight, or Shadow, or whatever you're calling him?" Emily stood, brushing off her jeans. "You're not going to believe me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'll tell you anyway." She led Jack and Luis into the barn, where the scent of hay and leather filled the air. Inside, she pointed to a wall covered with photos. Among them was a picture of a young Emily standing beside a small, black colt. The colt's eyes were unmistakable. "That's him," Emily said simply. Jack stared at the photo, his jaw tightening. It was impossible to deny. Midnight had been hers, once. "He was born here," Emily continued. "His mother, Star, was my mom's favorite mare. Shadow was different from the start. He followed me everywhere. We had this connection." She paused, glancing at Jack. "You probably think that sounds crazy." Jack didn't answer, his eyes still on the photo. Luis spoke instead. "It doesn't sound crazy, kid. Not after what we've seen. Emily nodded, encouraged. When we sold him, I thought I'd never see him again. It broke my heart. But when he ran to me yesterday, I knew he remembered. He's not just a racehorse. He's Shadow. Jack felt a mix of emotions bubbling inside him. Frustration, guilt, and something he couldn't quite name. He turned to Emily. You think you know what's best for him? That you understand him better than I do? Yes, Emily replied without hesitation. Because I'm not thinking about what I want from him. I'm thinking about what he needs. Jack stepped back, letting her words sink in. It was a hard truth to swallow, but there was no denying the bond between Emily and Midnight. It was something Jack had never seen before, not with any of his horses. That afternoon, Jack and Louise stayed at the farm, watching as Emily worked with Midnight. She didn't use commands or ropes. Instead, she relied on subtle cues, gestures, tones of voice, and a quiet presence that seemed to put the horse at ease. Midnight followed her willingly, his movements fluid and unforced. Jack, Louise said quietly, as they leaned against the barn door. Look at him. He's not just calm. He's happy. Jack didn't respond right away. He hated admitting when he was wrong, but deep down, he knew Louise was right. Midnight, Shadow, had found something here that Jack couldn't give him. When the sun began to set, Jack walked over to Emily, who was brushing Midnight's coat. I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice low. I can't just let him go, but I can't deny what I'm seeing either. Emily looked at him, her expression softening. You don't have to decide now. Just let him stay a little while longer. See what happens. Jack nodded reluctantly. All right, but this isn't forever. You hear me? I need him back. Emily smiled faintly. We'll see. As Jack climbed back into the truck with Louise, he felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure if winning the next race was the most important thing in his life. Jack stared at the photo Emily had pointed to. The young foal in the image, with his awkwardly long legs and bright, curious eyes, was unmistakably Midnight, or Shadow, as Emily called him. Standing beside him was a much younger version of Emily, her small arms wrapped around the foal's neck, her grin wide and carefree. The image struck something deep in Jack, a mix of recognition and unease. That's him, Emily said softly, breaking the silence. That's Shadow when he was just a few months old. Jack stepped closer, his calloused fingers brushing over the edge of the photo. This was your farm? Emily nodded, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Yeah, my mom bred horses here. Not a big operation, just a few mares. She always said Shadow was special. He was so smart, even as a baby. He followed me everywhere, like a puppy. That's why I called him Shadow. Louise, standing quietly behind Jack, looked at the photo and then at Emily. What happened? Why'd you sell him? Emily's face fell slightly, and she stepped back from the corkboard. We didn't have a choice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My mom got sick, the bills piled up, and we had to sell most of the horses. Shadow was the hardest to let go. I begged her to keep him, but she said he deserved a better life. She thought whoever bought him would take good care of him. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He didn't know what to say, and for a man who prided himself on having answers, that silence felt unbearable. He glanced at Midnight, who stood just outside the barn door, his head high and ears flicking back toward Emily. The horse seemed perfectly at ease here, like he belonged. You said he remembers you, Jack said finally, his voice gruff. Horses don't just remember faces from years ago. Emily tilted her head, her expression softening. Maybe not all horses, but Shadow. He's different. He's always been different. You can see it, can't you? The way he looks at me? The way he came straight here yesterday, like he knew where to go. Jack hesitated, his gaze shifting back to Midnight. He wanted to argue, to dismiss her words as sentimental nonsense, but he couldn't deny what he'd seen. Midnight had run straight to this girl, ignoring every barrier, every voice calling him back. It didn't make sense, but it was real. Louise broke the silence. Jack, she's not wrong. You saw it too. Midnight's never been like this before. Jack rubbed his face with his hands, his frustration boiling over. All right, he said, his voice sharp. So he remembers you. So what? What does that change? He's still my horse. I've put everything into him. Money, time, blood, sweat, everything. And now you're telling me I should just, what? Let him stay here? Forget about racing? Emily stepped closer, her eyes locking onto Jack's. I'm not telling you to forget anything, but you have to see how unhappy he is. You said you care about him. Prove it. Do what's best for him, not for you. The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He wanted to argue, to push back, but deep down, he knew she was right. Midnight had been restless, agitated. Ever since the training had intensified, Jack had chalked it up to nerves, but now he wondered if there was something deeper, something he had been too blind to see. You don't understand what you're asking, Jack said, his voice quieter now. This horse, he's everything I have left. Emily's expression softened, and she reached out to touch Midnight's neck. The horse leaned into her touch, his eyes half closed with contentment. And maybe you're everything he has left, but that doesn't mean you're doing what's best for him. The barn fell silent, the only sound the soft rustling of hay in the stalls. Jack stood there, torn between his loyalty to the life he'd built and the growing realization that he might have been wrong about Midnight all along. Finally, he let out a long breath and looked at Emily. All right, you win. He can stay here, for now. But this isn't over. I'm not giving him up. Emily nodded, her smile small but genuine. That's all I'm asking. Jack turned to leave, his boots heavy on the barn floor. As he stepped outside, he cast one last look at Midnight, standing calmly by Emily's side. For the first time, he wondered if the life he'd created for the horse he loved so much was the life Midnight truly wanted or needed. The drive back from Emily's farm was unusually quiet. Jack stared out the window, his jaw tight and his thoughts a whirlwind of emotions. Luis drove carefully, sensing the weight in the air between them but unsure how to break the silence. Finally, Luis spoke, his voice cautious. Jack, you did the right thing, letting him stay there for a while. It's what he needs. Jack didn't respond immediately. He let the words hang in the air, his grip tightening on the edge of his seat. What if I lose him? He muttered, almost to himself. What if this is the end of everything I've been working for? Luis glanced over, but kept his hands steady on the wheel. If you keep pushing him, you might lose him anyway. Maybe not physically, but Midnight, Shadow, whatever you want to call him. He's trying to tell you something. And I think deep down you know that. Jack leaned back in his seat, exhaling sharply. What am I supposed to do, Luis? Give up? Walk away? I've got debts, expectations. If Midnight doesn't race, I'm finished. Luis was silent for a moment, then said, maybe it's not about walking away. Maybe it's about finding a different way forward. Jack let the words sink in but didn't respond. The truck rumbled along the dirt road, carrying them back toward the stables. For Jack, the thought of losing Midnight as a racer felt like losing a part of himself. But the memory of the horse's calm demeanor at Emily's farm lingered in his mind, challenging everything he thought he knew about the life he had built for his horses. That evening, Jack found himself sitting in the tack room of his stable, a half-empty beer in his hand. The place was quiet, the other horses dozing in their stalls. Normally, this was his time to reflect and plan, to think about training schedules and race strategies. But tonight, his thoughts were elsewhere. He pulled out his phone and opened the photos he'd taken of Midnight over the years. Each image showed the horse in his prime, powerful, focused, and poised for victory. But as Jack scrolled through the pictures, he realized that none of them captured the calm, almost joyful expression he'd seen on Midnight's face that morning at Emily's farm. Jack's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. Luis stepped in, holding a small notebook. Found this in the office, he said, handing it to Jack. It's the notes from Midnight's original breeder. Jack took the notebook, flipping through the pages. They were filled with detailed observations about Midnight's early days, his lineage, and his temperament. One entry caught Jack's eye. Shadow is incredibly intelligent and emotionally aware. He forms bonds quickly and deeply. He's not just a horse, he's a companion. Whoever owns him will need to understand that he isn't suited for the typical life of a racer. He needs purpose, but also connection. Jack stared at the words, his chest tightening. He had always thought of himself as a good horseman, someone who cared deeply for his animals. But reading this, he couldn't help but wonder if he had misunderstood Midnight all along. He had treated the horse as an investment, a means to an end. Had he ignored the very qualities that made Midnight special? Luis broke the silence. Jack, I know this isn't easy, but maybe it's time to ask yourself what's more important, winning races or doing right by him. Jack closed the notebook, his jaw clenched. I don't know, Luis. I just don't know. The next morning, Jack returned to Emily's farm. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew he needed to see Midnight again, to see if the horse truly belonged there. Emily was waiting for him by the gate, her expression curious but calm. I didn't think you'd come back so soon, she said. Jack nodded toward Midnight, who was grazing peacefully in the pasture. I needed to see him. Emily opened the gate and walked with Jack toward the horse. Midnight lifted his head as they approached, his ears flicking forward in recognition. He didn't move away but stood still, his gaze steady. Jack ran a hand along Midnight's neck, feeling the warmth of his coat. I don't know what to do, Jack admitted, his voice low. I want to do what's best for him, but I don't know what that is anymore. Emily looked at him, her expression soft but firm. Maybe it's not about choosing one thing or the other. Maybe it's about finding a balance. You don't have to give up on racing entirely, but maybe you need to listen to what he's telling you. Jack sighed, his hand resting on Midnight's shoulder. And what if he doesn't want to go back? Emily smiled. Then you'll have to decide if keeping him as a racer is worth more than giving him the life he needs. Jack stood there for a long moment, the weight of her words sinking in. Midnight nickered softly, nudging Jack's hand as if offering his own answer. Jack couldn't help but smile faintly, though his heart still felt heavy. All right, he said finally. We'll see how this plays out. But if I leave him here, I'm going to need your help. Emily nodded. Deal. As Jack turned to leave, he realized that his journey with Midnight and Emily was far from over. But for the first time in years, he felt like he might be heading in the right direction. Jack's return to the farm the following week was different. This time, he came with no agenda, no need to assert control. Instead, he arrived early in the morning, when the sun was just breaking through the horizon and the fields were blanketed in a soft golden light. Emily greeted him by the fence, her demeanor calm and inviting, as if she had been expecting him all along. Midnight, or Shadow as Emily still called him, stood near the barn, his head low as he grazed peacefully. The horse exuded an ease Jack hadn't seen in months. Watching him now, Jack couldn't help but wonder if Midnight had been trying to tell him something all along, something Jack had been too stubborn to hear. Jack leaned against the fence, his gaze fixed on Midnight. You were right, he said quietly, surprising even himself with the admission. Emily, standing a few feet away, looked up at him. About what? Jack sighed, tipping his hat back. About him. About all of it. I've been so focused on what I wanted, what I thought was best, that I didn't stop to think about what he needed. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she watched Midnight for a moment, her hands resting lightly on the fence. It's not easy, she said finally, listening to what they're trying to tell us. But once you do, it changes everything. Jack nodded, her words resonating deeply. I've been thinking, he began, his voice hesitant. Maybe there's a way to find a middle ground. He doesn't have to race every event, doesn't have to live the way he has been. But I can't just let him go completely. I need him, Emily. Emily turned to face him, her blue eyes steady. And he needs you too. But not just as a racer, Jack. He needs you to be his partner. The words hung in the air, and Jack felt the weight of them settle in his chest. Partner. It wasn't how he'd thought of his horses before, not really. They had been his livelihood, his investments. But now, looking at Midnight, he realized how much he had taken for granted. I don't know how to do that, Jack admitted, his voice low. I've spent my whole life trying to win. I don't know how to be anything else. Emily smiled softly. You start by listening, by paying attention to what he's telling you. Jack nodded, his resolve hardening. All right, he said. Let's try this your way. The next few weeks brought a new routine for both Jack and Midnight. Jack spent more time at Emily's farm, observing and learning from her. She showed him how to read Midnight's body language, how to recognize when the horse was stressed or relaxed, and how to build trust in ways Jack had never considered before. One afternoon, as Jack and Emily worked together to groom Midnight, Jack found himself asking a question that had been on his mind for days. "Why do you care so much about him?" Emily paused, her brush still in hand. "Because he was there for me when no one else was," she said simply. "After my mom got sick, I spent hours in the barn with him. He was the only one who seemed to understand how I felt. Losing him was like losing a part of myself." Jack nodded slowly, the sincerity in her voice striking a chord. "I guess I've been so focused on what I need from him that I forgot he's not just a machine. He's more than that." Emily smiled faintly. "He is. And so are you, Jack." The comment caught Jack off guard, but he didn't argue. Instead, he let the words settle, feeling a sense of clarity he hadn't experienced in years. As the weeks turned into a month, Jack began to see a new version of Midnight. Or maybe it was the original version, the one he'd never really known. The horse was still fast, still powerful, but now there was a calmness, a sense of balance that had been missing before. Jack started to wonder if this new approach, one that prioritized Midnight's well-being over his own ambitions, might actually be the key to success. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the fields, Jack stood by the fence with Emily, watching Midnight graze. "I've made up my mind," he said finally, his voice steady. Emily turned to him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "About what?" "I want him to race," Jack said, "but only if he wants to. I'll take him back to the track, let him feel it out. If he shows me he's ready, we'll go for it. If not, he stays here with you." Emily studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's fair. But how will you know if he's ready?" Jack smiled faintly. "He'll let me know. I'm finally learning how to listen." For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace. Whatever happened next, he knew he was making the right choice, not just for himself, but for Midnight, and maybe even for Emily too. The morning of Midnight's first test run back at the track was unusually still. Jack stood in the stable, adjusting the saddle on Midnight's back, his hands steady despite the nerves coursing through him. Luis was nearby, double-checking the gear, his usual chatter absent as the weight of the moment settled between them. "You ready for this, boy?" Jack murmured, patting Midnight's flank. The horse shifted slightly but remained calm, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings. Jack had spent weeks rebuilding his connection with Midnight, learning to listen instead of just commanding. Today would be the real test, not of Midnight's abilities, but of Jack's willingness to trust him. Emily arrived a few minutes later, her presence a quiet reassurance. She had insisted on coming, not as a spectator but as part of the team. Jack had begrudgingly agreed, though now he was glad she was there. "Are you nervous?" she asked, standing beside Jack as he finished securing the saddle. Jack chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Nervous doesn't even begin to cover it. But it's not about me anymore. It's about him." Emily smiled, reaching out to stroke Midnight's neck. "He's ready. You've given him the chance to find his balance again. He trusts you now." Jack nodded, her words a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. "Let's see if I've earned it." The track was empty except for a few trainers and stable hands watching from the sidelines. This wasn't a race, just a practice run to see how Midnight would respond to the environment he had once dominated. Jack led Midnight to the starting gate, his heart pounding in rhythm with the horse's steady steps. As they approached the gate, Midnight hesitated, his ears flicking back and forth. Jack stopped, placing a hand on the horse's shoulder. "It's okay, boy," he said softly. "We're not here to push you. Just take it one step at a time." Midnight lowered his head slightly, as if considering Jack's words. After a moment, he stepped forward, his confidence returning. Jack glanced over at Emily, who stood by the rail, her expression one of quiet encouragement. Once Midnight was in position, Jack gave a nod to the trainer holding the stopwatch. "Let's keep it simple," he said. "No pressure." The gate opened with a metallic clang, and Midnight surged forward, his powerful legs eating up the track in long, fluid strides. Jack watched intently, his breath catching as the horse's speed increased. Midnight wasn't just running, he was flying. But there was something different about it this time. Something more controlled, more purposeful. As Midnight crossed the mock finish line, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The trainer called out the time, but Jack barely heard it. All he could focus on was the look in Midnight's eyes as the horse slowed to a trot and turned back toward him. There was no agitation, no restlessness, just a calm satisfaction that told Jack everything he needed to know. "He's still got it," Louise said, clapping Jack on the back. Jack smiled faintly but didn't respond. Instead, he walked over to Midnight, running a hand down the horse's sweat-dampened neck. "Good job, boy," he said softly. "You did great." Emily joined them, her face alight with excitement. "He looks amazing. How do you feel?" Jack met her gaze, his smile growing. "I feel like we're finally on the same page." Over the next few weeks, Jack, Emily, and Luis worked together to create a new plan for Midnight's future. Jack decided to enter him in selective races, focusing on events that prioritized the horse's well-being over sheer competition. Emily became an integral part of the team, visiting the track regularly and helping Jack understand Midnight's needs in ways he never had before. Their partnership extended beyond Midnight. Inspired by the journey they had been on, Jack and Emily began discussing ways to help other horses like Midnight, animals caught in the tension between their natural instincts and the demands of the racing world. Together, they launched a small program aimed at rehabilitating and rehoming retired racehorses, giving them a chance to find new purpose and connection. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low over the track, Jack stood by the rail, watching Emily work with a new horse they had taken in. Midnight stood nearby, grazing contentedly, his coat gleaming in the golden light. For the first time in years, Jack felt a sense of peace, not just because Midnight was thriving, but because Jack himself had finally found a way to balance his passion for racing with a deeper sense of purpose. Emily walked over, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. "What are you smiling about?" she asked, her tone teasing. Jack shrugged, leaning against the rail. "Just thinking. This isn't where I thought I'd end up, but it feels right." Emily smiled, her gaze drifting to Midnight. "Sometimes the best paths are the ones we don't plan." Jack nodded, his smile widening. For the first time, he understood what she meant. Midnight's journey had led them all here, to a place where racing was no longer just about winning but about connection, trust, and the promise of something greater. The Kentucky sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the paddocks as Jack, Emily, and Louise stood together by the fence. Midnight grazed peacefully nearby, his glossy black coat catching the warm light. It was a moment of quiet reflection for all of them, a rare pause in the whirlwind of the past few months. Jack watched Midnight, his hands resting on the worn wood of the fence. "You know," he said, breaking the silence, "if you told me 6 months ago that I'd be standing here with a kid teaching me about horses, I would have called you crazy." Emily smiled, brushing a strand of blonde hair out of her face. "And if you'd told me Shadow would come back to me, I wouldn't have believed it either." Louise chuckled, leaning back against the fence. "Life has a funny way of throwing curveballs, huh?" Jack nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had spent so much of his life chasing victories, pushing himself and his horses to their limits in pursuit of glory. But standing here now, watching Midnight thrive in a way he hadn't seen before, Jack realized that winning didn't look like he thought it would. The following weekend, Jack and Emily attended their first race together as partners. Midnight wasn't competing, not yet. Instead, they were there to promote their new program, Second Chances, aimed at rehabilitating and finding new homes for retired racehorses. Jack had expected skepticism from the racing community, but to his surprise, their booth attracted a steady stream of visitors. A woman in her 50s approached, her face lighting up when she recognized Jack. "You're Jack Connors, aren't you? I heard you were working on something new. What's all this about?" Jack exchanged a glance with Emily before answering. "It's about giving horses a life beyond the track," he said. "We're finding homes for retired racers, giving them a chance to reconnect with people in a way they couldn't before." Emily chimed in, her enthusiasm contagious. Some of these horses have so much more to offer than just speed. They can be companions, therapy animals, or even just pasture pets. We're trying to show people that their value doesn't end when their racing careers do. The woman nodded thoughtfully. I've got a small farm outside Louisville. I've always wanted to take in a horse. How do I get involved? Emily handed her a flyer, her smile widening. We'd love to help you find the right match. As the woman walked away, Jack looked at Emily, his chest swelling with pride. You're pretty good at this, you know. Emily laughed. I learned from the best. Later that day, as the final race concluded, Jack stood near the rail, watching the winning horse cross the finish line to thunderous applause. For the first time, he didn't feel the pang of regret or longing he usually felt when he wasn't part of the action. Instead, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Midnight wasn't in the race, but he had found something better, a purpose beyond the track. Emily joined him, leaning on the rail beside him. You okay? She asked. Jack nodded, his eyes still on the track. Yeah. For the first time in a long time, I think I am. They stood there in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. The track lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the emptying stands. Jack turned to Emily, his voice low but firm. You know, none of this would have happened without you. Emily looked up at him, her expression earnest. It wasn't just me. It was Shadow too. He brought us all here. Jack smiled, nodding. Yeah, he did. Months later, Jack and Midnight returned to the track. Not for competition, but for a demonstration showcasing the connection between horse and rider. Jack rode Midnight into the arena, the crowd's cheers washing over them. Emily and Louise watched from the sidelines, pride evident on their faces. Midnight moved with a grace and confidence that hadn't been there before, his every step a testament to the bond they had rebuilt. Jack guided him through the routine, his movements subtle and seamless. By the end of the demonstration, the crowd was on its feet, applauding not just the performance but the message behind it. As Jack dismounted and led Midnight out of the arena, he glanced at Emily, who was waiting by the gate. I think we're finally getting the hang of this, he said with a grin. Emily laughed. Told you all he needed was a little love and a lot of patience. Jack nodded, looking back at Midnight. Yeah, turns out that's all I needed too. The journey had been far from easy, but Jack, Emily, and Midnight had found something worth more than trophies or fame. A partnership built on trust, understanding, and a shared purpose. Together, they had carved out a new path, one that honored the spirit of the horses they loved and the people willing to fight for them. As they walked back toward the barn, the future felt wide open, full of possibilities. Midnight had found his home, Jack had found his purpose, and Emily had found her place. And for the first time, they all felt like they were exactly where they were meant to be. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly touching.